Well, I guess we'll go ahead and start. Check the Blackboard announcements, IDEA evaluations, give you some extra points to encourage you to do it. So make sure you check those. All right, our exams on Friday. Exams on Friday. Exam goes live probably about 5 in the morning. You'll have until about 11 o'clock to start it. 11 o'clock at night to start it. You may still see it, but after 11 you can't start it. So make sure you start it, and then it'll be accessible, so if you get kicked out you can log back in until your time limit's up. So let's talk about our lifespan. So life history strategies, we talked about like the three components of it. Life cycle was one, right? Choice of having a simple life cycle or a complex life cycle, choice of having resting stages built into our life cycles, and also choices of maintaining a constant sex throughout the life of the organism, or having the possibility of changing if the conditions specify that we would do better if we change sex. All right? So the second component is the lifespan, or how long should we live? And really what we're talking about with this lifespan is, should we age? Should we give the appearance of aging? And if so, what causes that? So the appearance of aging is termed senescence. Senescence is the degenerative changes that increase our mortality rates as our individuals age. All right, so senescence is the degenerative changes that increase the mortality rate as an individual's age. This gives us the appearance of aging. Now, what causes this is actually a combination of factors, and these factors are going to be both the internal factors and external factors. So factors internal to the organism, factors that are external to the organisms, but both of them kind of have the same end result, which is damage to our cells, damage to our repair mechanisms of our cells that ultimately lead to our appearance of aging. So one of the dominant internal factors that cause aging are these reactive oxygen species. These are oxygen ions, these are peroxides that are produced during normal metabolic activity that are ultimately toxic to our cells. All right, so these are just things that appear that are results, end products of metabolic pathways that damage our cells. And we have mechanisms to deal with this, mechanisms to try to neutralize these species, as well as mechanisms aimed at repairing any damage that they might cause. So the reactive oxygen species, these are the internal, probably the most common internal factor that causes aging. The external factors are the natural environmental injury that degrades our cellular machinery, degrades our repair mechanisms, and so forth. You've probably heard a lot of this. UV light gets talked about a lot. All of the commercials about wearing sunscreen to protect from cellular damage that the UV light causes, wrinkles and aging and so forth. That's all because of damage to our cellular machinery. In some cases, it's mutations that get caused, and if those mutations are in a repair mechanism, in a gene that produces proteins and stuff to repair the damage, then we can get aging. And the UV light isn't the only type of external injury. Any external factor that leads to injury of our cells, injury of the cellular repair mechanisms, could produce aging or give the appearance of aging. All right? Now, what ultimately causes it? We talked about the factors, the internal and external factors, and in some cases we have individuals that live longer than others. You've got individuals that live 100 plus years, other individuals that naturally die at age 70, 80. If we look at populations of species, one population may live 7, 8 years, another population could live 4 or 5. if you go back to those survivorship curves, to the lecture where we introduced the survivorship curves, I had a graph on there that had two different populations of an antelope species, and one species lived longer than the other. Why? Both of them are faced with internal factors and external factors. Why would one live longer than the other? And is it genetic? Can we experimentally increase our lifespan? Well, there's three hypotheses that are out there that could explain aging. And we'll go through each of these alone. So the mutation accumulation hypothesis, the pleiotropic effects hypothesis, and the limiting soma hypothesis. All three of these are independent hypotheses. Is any one hypothesis responsible for aging? Probably not. It's probably two of them, maybe all three at work. All right? But we're going to go one by one and talk about it. So, the mutation accumulation hypothesis, what does that say? This hypothesis is a stochastic theory, meaning that it's going to be random as to whether or not we're going to experience aging. All right? This could explain why identical twins, clonal twins, can look different in old age. One may experience or have an appearance of aging, the other might not. All right? So it's entirely random. Now, what's the process? Well, as it's based on the name, we're going to have an accumulation of mutations, and these mutations ultimately produce the aging. But why? Why do we get these mutations? Well, it all comes down to the environmental injury. This will also be our internal injury as well, so the reactive oxygen species. We have cellular injury that happens and causes deleterious effects. And those effects could be mutation, those effects could be damage to our cellular repair mechanisms. If those mechanisms are damaged, those repair mechanisms, then it allows the mutations to persist. So yeah, you can get a mutation, but then we have cellular repair mechanisms that come back and fix it. All right? And we're not talking about mutations as we're copying our genes. We're talking UV light hits it, and you can stimulate some mutations, cause mutations. That's where our repair mechanisms come into play. They do the proofreading, and if it's wrong, it fixes it. And we're saying that proofreading mechanism, the repair mechanism, it's damaged. So the mutations can't be repaired, and over time, the mutations start to build up in our cells. Eventually, the mutations hit a threshold to where we start seeing the end results of those mutations. We start seeing the appearance of aging taking place. Now, what is that appearance of aging? It could be any number of things, but ultimately, it's going to be a decrease in survivorship or increase in mortality rates. So the mutation accumulation hypothesis, this is just one theory. It's a stochastic theory. Questions on that? The second theory for aging is the pleiotropic effects hypothesis. So what is this? This is a deterministic theory, so it's programmed, and it relies on our genes having or exhibiting pleiotropy. What is pleiotropy? It means that a single gene can affect more than one phenotype. Now, this is different than phenotypic plasticity. And we talked about definitions of phenotypic plasticity, right? You've got one genotype can produce multiple phenotypes based on the environment, based on the development. That's not really what this is. This is saying, this pleiotropy is saying that we have our one gene, and it has an effect at one point in our life, but then it has a different effect later on. And for this hypothesis, what we're saying is that we have some genes that selection has favored, that selection has gotten in a higher frequency in our population. And the reason those genes are in a higher frequency is because they have some benefit to our organism. And the benefit that it's conferring is in terms of reproduction. Perhaps survival early on in life, perhaps reproductive output, perhaps some trait that allows you to get mates. that gene is favorable. Selection is going to select for that gene. And it works until you're done reproducing. And then as soon as you're done reproducing, now that gene is bad. There's no benefit to it because you've already passed your reproductive peak. You're basically on the decline in terms of reproductive potential. The increase in frequency of these bad genes, the collection of these bad effects, is what causes our decrease in survivorship. And this is going to happen after our peak reproductive period. So go back to our reproductive value curve. That's that VX curve. Remember, we talked about how it increases up until we hit a reproductive maturity. And then it declines. So all the way through this time, we probably have benefits to our genes. But then after that peak, if our genes get expressed, now they don't confer an advantage. And that confers, that gives us the appearance of aging. Now this kind of sets up a dilemma. We've got selection favoring it at one time period, selection not favoring it in another time period. So why does this win out? Why do they get selected for? Why do they persist in the environment? Well, it's because it occurs, the bad effects are felt after our reproductive peak. After we hit our peak and we start on the decline, the effects of selection start to decline on those genes. So we go back to that idea of fitness again. It's a property of our genotype, it's a property of our environment, and we measure it over more than one generation. That more than one generations comes into play here after our peak. If we have a bad gene and selection selecting against it, if we don't reproduce, there is no effect. We're not reproducing. Even if we have a gene that's actually absolutely fantastic for us, selection can't pick it up. Selection can't expand it because we've passed our reproductive peak. So these pleiotropic effects, yeah, we're going to select for genes that may do us well for reproduction, but as soon as we finish reproduction, it's a liability, and selection can't take it out. And it's the collection of those liabilities that ultimately give the appearance of aging. All right, so that's hypothesis number 2. Number 3 is the limiting soma theory, limiting soma hypothesis. This is mostly deterministic. And it's mostly deterministic. And it's mostly deterministic because of the process of how it works. So this goes back to the idea that our organisms have a finite amount of energy that they have to allocate. And they allocate it to one of 3 different processes: growth, reproduction, and maintenance. And we said that if we allocate it to one of those, that energy is not available for the other 2 processes. So if we allocate it to growth, we don't have that energy available for reproduction or maintenance. Well, the limiting soma theory hypothesizes that once we begin reproducing, our organism takes energy and starts diverting it away from the other processes and dumping it all into our reproduction. And that means we don't have energy available for cellular maintenance. We don't have energy available for our repair mechanisms. So it's the lack of maintenance of this cellular machinery then ultimately leads to cellular damage and the decrease in survivorship. So if you just kind of go back and compare some of these, that mutation accumulation hypothesis relied on maintenance, somatic maintenance. But where that one went wrong was that we had mutations. We had environmental injury that damaged that maintenance, that allowed mutations to persist. This one, we're saying we've just stopped funding it. We've stopped providing energy to it. And because we've stopped providing energy, all of a sudden now we start seeing the increase in mortality rates as we age. This is mostly deterministic because not every organism is going to reproduce. Some reproduce more than others. And the idea is that the more you reproduce, the more energy that was diverted to reproduction, the less that was available for maintenance, and thus those individuals should exhibit higher mortality rates. So delaying reproduction then, if this hypothesis is true, should lead to a reduction in senescence. Does it? Good idea. It's a question mark. Kick these lights back on. But there is some ideas, some truth to that. It's here. That's why we talk about it. All right, so these three processes, they're not independent of each other. All right. Probably all three have evidence that supports the idea of aging. And I bet all three probably contribute in some way to the appearance of aging. So, is aging genetic then? Short answer is yes, it is. It is. How do we know that? We know that from selection experiments. We've got selection experiments on fruit flies. We have selection experiments on Caenorhabditis elegans, the nematode that serves as a model organism. All right? And in both of these, you have experiments where researchers have experimentally selected for those longer-lived organisms so that you then generate a population that lives longer than the wild-type population. In some cases, much longer, twice as long. It's pretty significant. So if the lifespan of C. elegans is, let's say, 2 months, now you have these mutants that live 4 months. Now, in these experiments, they then go that next step and say, why? What did we select for that allowed these organisms to live longer than their wild type, than other wild type populations? And in most cases, it comes back to our cellular repair mechanisms. In the fruit fly experiment, they saw that they had 3 copies of a repair gene that allows them to live longer than the wild type who only had 1 copy. And you could say, well, why is that? Why did the 3 copies make the difference? Well, you've got two explanations. One, with each copy of the gene, you've got more proteins that can be produced. All right, so if you need to mass produce a lot of proteins, having 3 copies is better than 1, especially if all 3 can get turned on at the first time. But probably the one, and I think it's the one that they actually mentioned, or that they talked about here, the idea is that you have 3 copies. So if you get a mutation in 1 copy, you still have 2 other ones that are there that can function. If you get a mutation in that 2nd copy, you still have 1 more cellular repair gene that is fully functional. It's only until you get that 3rd mutation, in that 3rd gene, when you start seeing the damage. All right, so that kind of goes back, this idea goes back to the mutation accumulation hypothesis then, that it's all linked to the mutations, it's all linked to environmental damage or reactive oxygen species damage. And that's also some of the repair mechanisms, reactive oxygen neutralizing genes. All right, question, so is it genetic? Yeah, it is. You can live longer, and that's why we can look at it across a species and you can see different populations that have different lifespans. The combination of these 3 hypotheses have kind of produced those differences. All right, so summary here. Senescence, aging. It's a result from factors that are going to increase the mortality rate as a function of age. Our survivorship declines. All right? We know that there's internal factors. We know that there's external factors, all that have an effect on aging or that cause aging. All right? Is it genetic? Yeah, it is. Lifespan does have a genetic component. It might not be 100%, but at least it has a genetic component, and that means then that selection can function. Selection can favor individuals that live longer, or perhaps individuals that don't live as long. And the other main idea that I want you to take away from this lecture is that we have these deleterious mutations that could develop that increase our mortality rates. If those mutations develop, or if our gene expression, if the genes, these bad genes, get expressed later in life, meaning after the peak of our reproductive value curve, then selection is going to have a very hard time of removing it. If it occurs after this spot, so when we stop reproducing, so we still live, but we stop reproducing, selection has zero effect. There's no way selection can remove this because we're not reproducing. Our reproductive value is zero at that point. Before the peak, yes, selection can act, and then the selection can act all through this part. It's just the effects are going to be much less. Once we hit here, once we hit our 0 point, that's it. Selection can't act. We're not reproducing. It goes back to our idea of fitness. Remember those 3 points. Questions? Yes? No? All right. You had a question. So, can an extra repair mechanism become part of the cell and decrease the life since the cell relies on extra repair mechanisms? I think we're going to have to rephrase that. Not quite sure what you're asking. So I had a question. So can an extra repair mechanism become part of the cell and decrease the life since the cell relies on these repair mechanisms? See if we can get it rephrased. As we're getting the questions, the quiz for this is going to go live. You'll have through Wednesday to do it. All right, you'll have through Wednesday to do it. Our exam's on Friday. Our exam material stops here. All right, we're going to stop here. Our last part of the exam, or of the course, is going to be on our reproductive efforts. So that one's going to probably cover lecture on Wednesday, and then we'll probably end up on Monday. We'll finish that on Monday. If we need to, I'll go into Wednesday as well of next week, but I'm kind of hoping that we'll finish. It just kind of depends on how long it takes. But we'll talk about our reproductive side of things for our life histories. All right. So if evolution results in depending on the extra repair mechanism to perform normal functions after the evolution of the additional function. So still not quite sure here. So if we have an extra cellular repair mechanism. So I think in the fruit fly what they saw was that it was a duplication. Was the method that produced the extra repair mechanisms. Now those are neutral unless there's a selective force that's favoring the longer life in individuals. So in that case, in the lab setting, they did apply that selective force. In the natural setting, I'm not sure how long life is going to favor our individual unless that longer life gave us extra reproductive times that increase the area under that VX curve. All right, so if we have an extra mutation that developed that produced those cellular repair mechanisms, there has to be some sort of benefit if selection is going to favor. Now, perhaps what you're asking, yep, exactly. So there's a possibility that you can get this mutation, this duplication that happens, to get another cellular repair mechanism, but if there's no selection, it's just like a neutral mutation. Maybe it'll persist, but I bet a lot of the times it gets taken out. But if our organisms start to experience a different environment that now is favoring these extra repair mechanisms, so let's say, more UV radiation or some sort of toxic compound that goes into the environment, now we have that selective force where any of the individuals that had that neutral mutation, that extra copy, are now being favored, and then that becomes the new normal. All right, that becomes the new normal. Now, if that environmental injury gets taken out, so let's say we'll use the UV light, because that was a concern back in the 80s and 90s when I was going to school, was that the ozone hole was going to grow and we were going to lose all ozone in the earth. I mean, that's kind of what they were teaching in school, believe it or not. But the concern was that all of a sudden we're going to have all of this UV light shining down on us, all right, causing mutations. All right, that's going to favor additional cellular repair mechanisms. If that UV light finishes and ends and disappears, we kind of revert back to normal situations. If there is a cost to having that extra gene, so let's say we are producing more proteins, but we don't necessarily need the genes, now we can have our selective force favoring the removal of those genes, so kind of get us back to only that one copy. So I think, yeah, that's if our cell needs more repair mechanisms just to keep up with the changing environment, and that changing environment includes additional damage to our cells, yeah, selection could favor it. Selection can favor it, as long as it gets favored and it's having an effect on our individuals before that VX peak. So we'll talk about our reproductive output because that's the other side of the coin. All of this is a collection of trade-offs. Right now we're talking about repair mechanisms to increase our lifespan. What happens if that environmental injury is triggering our species, our individual senses that? What if they can avoid that injury by increasing their reproductive output and say, hey, environment's changing, let's up our reproductive output in a way that still maximizes our fitness? That is a response. That's a different response, but it's possible. All right. Quiz will go live. I think I had it going live around 8:30 maybe. It'll go live. Lab this week. You're going to go measure your rootlets, check germination success. Next week we'll be outside. Diaspores. So that'll be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Final exams on Friday. Can you believe it? All right, next week Friday. Final exam, it will be online. It will be longer, but it'll be the same format. In the sense that it'll get released at 5 in the morning or 5:30 in the morning, and you'll have all day to start it. All right, all day to start it. Just warn you that if you start it too late, I mean, I don't stay up until 1 in the morning. So you're taking a risk that if you have a problem, I'm not available to respond to an email. All right, we're gonna call it here. We're going to talk and give you time to start reviewing your notes for the exam. All right. If you have questions, email me.